Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So I've been wondering whether I would share this data point with you guys for a long time because it feels like it's slightly dangerous information to share. Multiple research studies looking at meetings like this say that some of the most valuable things that happen during these meetings happen when you're not sitting down, but you're all over there talking to each other. So that's really cool that you guys are doing that. But again, I feel that's a little bit dangerous to share. So please, since I brought you into that circle of trust, like use that data point for good and not evil as we move forward in today's agenda and other out in front meetings. So again, good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Cook. I'm the Executive Director of Talent Management in the Office of Vice Chancellor for Institutional Advancement. So glad to see you guys here today and hope everyone is having a wonderful summer. And we have another really terrific program today. We're continuing to follow the format of connecting the stages of the cultivation cycle with core high-level concepts in a big picture way that will help all of us to work better together and continue to improve our performance as a team. And so this is our third of 4 out in front sessions for 2016. In just a moment, I'm going to introduce Kate McDowell, who will spend time with us today working on storytelling thinking. At 2:30, as we've done in the past, we'll be breaking into work groups and going to different breakout rooms to talk about how to apply the concepts that Kate has shared with us. And I'm going to announce the rooms at 2:30 when we break, but frontline fundraisers and CAOs will stay in here. A little bit of a change. So alumni relations, stewardship, special events, annual giving will all be in the humanities room today, which is a little more of a walk around the corner. So if you wore your Fitbit, you get like 25 extra steps like going in there. So thanks for that, or you're welcome. And then marketing and communications will be in the leadership boardroom, and we have all of the signage arranged for that. So, and then we'll return to the room and be ready to go at 3 o'clock for the all-staff portion of our meeting. Kate McDowell, our speaker today, has been teaching storytelling for more than a decade. With administration, advocacy, and non-for-profit board experience, she knows that there are many kinds of stories told and needed to work to be successful in work environments. Students in her hands-on graduate seminars, and just to take the pulse of everyone, who here is a GISLIS grad? Or I'm sorry, iSchool.
Hey, we're still doing it too. It's fine.
Who here is a GISLIS grad? Okay, cool. Who here has had Kate McDowell in a class before? Okay, we got a couple of them. Awesome. So she works as an associate professor in the School of Information Sciences, and for the past 2 years, Kate has partnered with different teams in advancement here at Illinois. She also presented at Case 5 in Chicago in 2015 and earned the designation as a stellar speaker. So I'm really excited and happy to share her with our advancement audience, and she's also become a really good friend, so I'm really thrilled she's here today. So Kate, the audience is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thanks. Let's see, I'm going to be double mic'd here for a minute, and we'll see how that goes, so just let me know. All right. Thanks so much for having me. As Elizabeth said, I've been working on storytelling and teaching storytelling for 10 years. I've been working with folks doing the kind of work that you're doing in one shape or another for about 2 years, and I've been listening. And I hope that one of the things that this presentation will show you is that I've been listening, because I hope I can bring you back some of the insights from the groups I've worked with over the last 2 years to help move forward what you're doing. So, storytelling. There's a lot of evidence at this point that our brains are wired for story. The way I like to talk about this, and some of you have heard me say this before, is that when you think about what's most meaningful to you, chances are good that you don't store that in a database, you don't store it in a chart, you don't store it in a list, You store that information in your brain as a story. You remember the time when. You remember the moment that. You remember when your grandmother said, right? You remember a story of something that happened, and that's how our brains are wired. So understanding how storytelling works can be really valuable and beneficial for interacting with humans all over the world. We learn from the stories we hear, and more than that even, we learn from the stories that we live. So when I'm talking about storytelling, I'm talking about a couple of different things, and one thing is certainly the stories that shape our lives. Another thing is folklore. I'm really interested in stories that have persisted. I don't know how many of you have played Pokemon Go yet. I was out there this morning doing that, actually, with my good friend Celeste Choate, director of Urbana Free Library. I have permission to tell you this. And we were trying it out. We were just sort of on our morning walk, seeing kind of how that went. I don't know if that story's going to last or not, right? That story just started. It's about 5 minutes old. So we'll see if that's something that's interesting 10, 20, 30 years from now. I'm going to tell you a story today that goes back hundreds of years. The stories I'm most interested in are the ones that have already lasted, and that's what folklore is all about. Folklore as a discipline is about taking stories and putting them on the page. Now, the second place I come from, in addition to some of the admin things Elizabeth mentioned, is children's librarianship. And children's librarianship is about taking stories back off the page. So I'm interested in that dynamic relationship. Storytelling is something that moves in and out of print from I would say, from social media into our day-to-day conversations, and hopefully stories that really last. So that's the focus that I have when I bring to this. And you know there are a lot of people talking about storytelling these days. I don't really have to tell you that. There are a lot of different ways that you'll see storytelling used. I am talking about storytelling as a kind of meaning building. We have storied minds, and I want us to think about learning stories by heart. So the discipline of storytelling that you study in library and information science, in the School of Information Sciences, is actually about learning a story well enough that when you tell it, you are not performing like you would be as an actor on a stage in theater, and you are not doing comedy like you would be in a comedy club and making people laugh for the sake of laughter. You are having a trusting relationship with your audience. Your audience trusts that you have something you want to tell them, and that inspires them to want to hear you. But you're also in a relationship. So part of what's going on in any actual storytelling interaction is that there's a back and forth. So those of you who've seen some of my presentations before will recognize this triangle. This triangle differentiates storytelling from other kinds of communication. There are lots of great kinds of communication. I don't want to knock any of them here today. I actually think storytelling can intersect with all of them, but they aren't all identical. Storytelling as a form of communication is an interaction between three things: the teller, the tale, and the audience. Now, what's important for you about that are a couple of things. First of all, the teller is not always the most important thing. We feel like we're on the spot when we're telling a story. I certainly feel like I'm on the spot with you guys, but we're not necessarily the most important thing. Our tale, our meaning, our content might be more important than any individual in that moment. And that's what being part of a big project like advancement at the University of Illinois or any large institution, that's what that's about. So the tale can be more important. Another thing, you already know this, the audience. The audience is paramount. The audience is always central to this interaction. But centrality does not mean that it doesn't change over time. So I'll show you another way I think about this, which is that the triangle shifts over time. So storytelling is a dynamic process. It is not just one delivery of message. I was talking earlier actually with Marianne, and she was asking if I teach writing, and I said, no, I teach storytelling. I really do. I think the things I teach might be useful for writing. I would encourage you to think about some of the tools you'll use today and think about how you might move those into writing. But I'm interested in the dynamic that occurs when people are telling each other stories. I'm particularly interested in live, and in my courses I also teach digital video, sort of digital storytelling, which is video-based storytelling. So those kinds of things. I'm interested in reception and interaction because I want to talk about those stories that last, right? I want to teach people, I want to be involved in, I want to think about the stories that last over time. So how does a story last? A story doesn't last by staying exactly the same. I could say, there are a lot of words, an institution doesn't stay exactly the same either, does it, right? There are a lot of things that change over time. Telling, listening, and bringing in new data sometimes, and by data I mean this broadly. I did just recently do a data and storytelling workshop, but I mean this very broadly. Data storytelling is a little bit different than folklore, and I'll get into that a bit too later on as we go into some of the exercises. But telling, listening, and retelling. That retelling thing is in some ways where the magic happens. We want to tell stories that people want to retell about our institution, right? That's really a key part of what we're doing here. So reception, reiteration, revisioning, recreation, this happens every time you tell the same story to a different audience. This happens every time an audience responds to your story. They might laugh, they might cry, they might clap, they might leave. There are a lot of different possibilities for how audiences can react. It's very important to remember that the audience is part of that process. It's not just the tale either. So let me tell you a story. Once, long ago, there was a man, and he had grown old, and he didn't have a lot of money left, and he lived by himself in a cottage under an old apple tree. And he was anxious, and he was worried. And one night, he had a dream, and in the dream, he heard a voice, and the voice said, "Go to the bridge in the village and stand there for 3 days, and your fortune will come to you." Well, this was a strange thing to be told, but seeing no better options, he did this. And the first day, he stood on the bridge as the sun rose, and as it beat down in the heat of the day, and as the sun set. And the second day, he did the same thing again all day long. And on the third day, as the sun traveled across the sky, and just as it was setting, a young man came up to him and said, "Say, I've seen you on this bridge. I think I've seen you here 3 days in a row. I go back all the time delivering goods across this bridge. What are you doing?" And the man said, "Well, I had a dream, and in the dream it said that I should stay on this bridge and I should wait for 3 days, and if I did, my fortune would come to me." And the young man laughed. He said, "Wow, that's something. Yeah, I got to tell you, that's really an interesting thing to hear, but I don't know why you're bothering with this. I mean, if we all listened to our dreams, where would we be? I mean, I had a dream last night, and I had dreamed that I had to dig under this apple tree and I would find a chest of gold, but you don't see me just, throwing off my cart and running down the street and, going and digging under every apple tree. What use would that do?" And he just chuckled and laughed and walked off down the bridge. The old man lit up, and he thought to himself, "I wonder if this is it." And he ran home, and he got out a shovel, and he dug until he struck metal, and underneath the apple tree in its very own front yard was a chest of gold. And in that chest of gold was enough wealth that he could be comfortable and happy for the rest of his days. And that's the story of the dream in the old apple tree. I didn't make that story up. This story has been told in Ireland, Turkey, England, Persia, Isle of Man, Germany. Let me think if there's a few others. This was just the research I did in a cursory way on this story, right? And I found 30 different versions from these different cultures. It may be that nothing is exactly universal, and I think that's important to keep in mind. But when stories travel with that kind of intensity and stay alive for that long, I think it's worth paying attention to them. So I'm interested in the kinds of things that you can do. So let's move on to talking about what I've learned from you. So for the last 2 years, I've been listening to you guys, and I've learned a lot of things. So one thing I've learned is that advancement stories have certain kinds of content, right? You've been telling me these stories, if not you individually, then, but some of you individually have, and you know who you are, right? So you've been telling me these stories. I've been hearing stories about what works in advancement. So I've been bringing that in my mind, a lot of thought, and I've been trying to think about how to categorize it. And so far, these are the categories. And in a minute, I'll ask you if I'm right. So you can tell me things I've missed here. But students, meaning what's going on with current students or people who have just graduated. So that sense of the immediate impact of education, right? Somebody gets an education, what do they do right after? That's what I mean by students. It could be right during or right after. So students is kind of one category of story that I see being really important for the work that you're doing. Programs and projects, and this could be internal or external to your organizations, is another really important kind of story. So the easiest ones to think about, of course, are news stories, and I have some examples for you, and we're going to work with those in just a bit. Because I'm not going to talk or tell you stories forever. I'm really not. I'm just getting you started. So programs and projects is the second one. And then alumni and donors. So where have they gone since? What's the long arc of where people go? What have people who went here, what have they accomplished in their whole careers? I care about this one a lot myself. I'm a double alum from U of I. I have got my master's and my PhD here, and they hired me to stay. I always like to say it's a great honor and a lot to live up to, because those things are both true. But I care a lot about what happens to our students and the people who are here in the long run. So So that's what I see as being what is most important to think about telling. And what I've done today, and we're going to transition to this in just a little bit more after I give you a little orientation to where we're going to take this. What I've done today is I've given you, well, actually, this is a good place to pause and ask, what am I missing? Are there any kinds of stories that come to mind? I actually have a place to take notes if you tell me something that I haven't thought of yet. You don't have to tell me right now. But I am curious about this question of what am I missing? All right, I'm going to move on for the moment. That's a good sign. It means I probably got most of it. It's probably not everything, so please don't hesitate to come up to me. I'll hang around a little bit after, and we can chat. But I would like to know what am I missing. You could also email me later if you can think of things. So another thing I've done in my workshops before with advancement multiple times is I've talked about what can we ask. So how do you get those great stories, right? Because stories of students, we may know the students, in which case it's great. We may know the alums, in which case it's great. We may know the projects, in which case it's great. But a lot of times we don't know these things. Us, the News Bureau, we're all trying to do the same thing, right? I mean, some of us are on the News Bureau, right? So we're all trying to do the same thing, which is to figure out where are these great stories. And so I've done this exercise a number of times. And I'm actually not going to do it with you guys today. I'm going to tell you what I found over the last 2 years, and we're going to do some other exercises that go a little deeper into story structure. What I've found is that someplace between nostalgia and future impact is where we ask most of our questions in advancement. And so that's really interesting to me. So when I said, what do you ask to get these great stories? A number of people told me, I ask what you remember about campus. I ask what was your favorite place on campus. I ask what was most meaningful to you? What extracurricular activities did you do on campus? But it's about the place, right? It's about where we were. This is an interesting one for me. First of all, I love hearing stories about people's lives, so that's a fantastic kind of question, and I think that's a great place on the spectrum. I'd call this a spectrum of kinds of questions to ask. So that's one place. That's a thing that becomes more complex when you have things like online programs, which we have increasingly more of. And so thinking about, in fact, our school just celebrated the 20th anniversary of its online program, and we had to figure out how to capture that nostalgia, that experience. A lot of those stories were about struggle and trouble, because that's what most human stories are about, is struggle and trouble. But overcoming technology, struggle and trouble. We're going to have a lot of stories from this era about that, that's for sure. The other end of the spectrum is future impact. And future impact can be as direct as, so what do you want to make happen at the university now? Where do you want to have an impact? Where do you want your gifts to matter? What do you want to do? And in order to do that, of course, you've got to know what are the available sort of opportunities for that. What are the projects? What's going on? What are the scholarship funds? All the different things that you guys know. But that spectrum, I think, captures the what do we ask range pretty well, at least when we're starting that conversation about how do you want to support the university. And I use the word donation a lot. When I say donation, I actually mean money, time, services, or anything else, because I think it's important to remember that there are people who serve this campus just by continuing to be present despite being paid nothing for their time, which is amazing. Is there anything that you ask that doesn't fit in this spectrum when you're having a conversation with a potential donor? This is what I've learned from you guys over the last couple of years. I'd also love to know if you have other ideas about this. That'd be great. So now let me go into some things that impact how we tell stories, and then I want to get started with examples and learning some stories and what's the best way. I've been teaching storytelling for 10 years. I have some ideas about the best way to most efficiently learn stories. So I'm going to let you try some of my best ideas out today, and you'll see what you think about them. But I'm excited for that, because some of this stuff is brand new. I've done a lot of workshops for you guys, but this is actually new material. So this part is older. I want to make sure we just briefly do a detour and talk about the ethics of storytelling, because it's not quite as simple as we just take stories and tell them. Part of why I looked to see what the dream in the old apple tree, what the sources were on that, I just wanted to remind myself of the sources, is because it's important to know if something's been told a lot by a lot of different people, in which case you can feel pretty confident. You can adapt your own version, and you're probably not taking it from any one cultural source. You're probably not appropriating it or making personal gains or money off of somebody else's cultural heritage or property or anything else like that. So there are three kinds of ownership of stories that I think it's important for us to think about in an advancement context, but in a lot of other contexts too. And that is when it's a person story, so people's stories, that can be individual or collective. In that case, in some ways, the answer is easy. You just ask them. You just ask the person, could I tell that story? Like I asked my friend Celeste this morning, you mind if I mention Pokemon Go? And she said, sure, that'd be great, right? So do you mind if I tell that story is a really easy way to ask somebody for permission to tell a story. Second one's real tricky, and I won't be able to cover it today because it's a whole workshop and/or class of itself, but a culture's stories. So I mentioned cultural appropriation, I mentioned making money off of other people's intellectual property in various ways. There are a lot of debates, hotly contested debates around indigenous concepts of intellectual property that do not match up to the laws that we may have to follow. So there are legal things, but there are also ethical things. So I want to mention that because when in doubt, if you're dealing with a story that you think may belong to a culture and you're not of that culture and you're not sure what to do, this is a great place to start asking more questions. This is a really excellent place to say, I'm not as familiar as I should be. Who could I consult? You guys have great networks, so mobilize them when you have that kind of question. And don't hesitate to reach out to me too. I'm not the only expert in this kind of area, but I've dealt with some of these kinds of questions, so I could help with that kind of thing. And then the third one, and this is what we're talking about most today, is an institution stories. It can be institution, it can be organization. In some ways, it doesn't matter if it's profit or non-for-profit or if it's just a social group. I mean, it can be any kind of institution, but someplace where people deliberately gather, and that gathering has a life of its own. That gathering has been going on for long enough that there are stories to tell about it. So an institution stories, in some ways, are our bread and butter, and they are a bit easier to mobilize because we're paid to, but we're also trying to do the same kinds of things. We're trying to promote the work that we do. And we're also trying to assess it and make sure that it's valuable, all kinds of things there. I always like to put up this quote when telling anywhere it is common courtesy to credit the source of your story. So it's hard when the source is not one source but 30, like the dream in the old apple tree. But it's good to do that. It's important to do that, especially when it's a person's story. Every once in a while, somebody will say, you can tell it, but I don't want my name attached to it. So in that case, you anonymize. And anonymization is also a very healthy tool to be thinking of in these contexts. Because not always do you need the story to be bound to data and evidence. Sometimes you need the story to be accurate, but told in a particular moment to a particular person for a purpose. So accuracy, I think, is important with institutional stories. But anyhow, that's background on ethics. That's your like ethics 101 in about 3 minutes. So there's more to talk about there, but we'll move on. We want to move stories from print into conversation. I'm making that argument for you, and that's what I'm going to try to help you do today. But I think we want to do that because when we have stories, there are these moments when those stories are going to connect with somebody. And if we know those stories well and we understand how they're put together and kind of what the bones of those stories are, then we can tell them in lots of different ways. We can mobilize them quickly in lots of different contexts. So let's just look at some examples. I have put on your tables, and it's going to get all shuffly in a minute in here, but I've put on your tables about 6 to 7 copies. They're in the middle of the table, turned over, 6 to 7 copies of 3 different stories. And the stories are from the News Bureau, and I basically used the rubric that I was creating of students, programs, and alumni to pull some stories. So I chose these because they fit those categories. They're 2 sets. So at one set of tables, and I believe it's over here, you guys have a story about ACES reaching out to youth. You have a story about a glass artist, and then you have a story about Temple Grandin. So take one each of those for everybody. They're sort of collated. There's no super unmessy way to do this without having them stapled, and that's got disadvantages. I want you to be able to move them around. Over here, you guys should have student recycling, a Japanese alumni who won a major award, and endowed chairs. Does that fit what you've got? Okay, good. Okay, so I want you now to take 5 minutes and read these stories. Ready? Ready? Take 5 minutes to read these stories. Just skim them real quick. Okay, ready, go. Okay, you're great readers. You're beating the time. I knew you would. Makes sense to me. All right, so what I want to do real quick is just say, so I mentioned to you I chose these as examples. These are just examples that fit the categories that I've been gleaning from my conversations with people in advancement over the last couple of years. So they are examples you may have been involved with, right? I know that because you are working all over this amazing campus, so that's completely possible. They are examples that I'm not picking them so much because I want us to critique. It's very familiar now for a professor to say, no, we're going to take them apart. I'm actually not, throw that out the window. I'm picking them for us to mobilize them, right? I want them to come up off the page. So that's what's important to me about what we're going to do next. So I want you to, at your tables, now I'm going to give you like, I'll call it 10 minutes, but you know I'm going to cut you short when I can tell you're done. So anyhow, so we'll call it 10 minutes. But I want you to think about what happens when someone says, tell me something important about what's going on at the university, right? What happens when someone says, I need to know what's happening here. If you had these stories before you, and if you can choose one to talk about first, and if you get done with that one, move on to the next one, and then move to the third one. But choose one to talk about first together. And there are 3 questions. When would you tell this? How would you tell it? And what's most important? What's most important about this story? So I'm going to give you 10 minutes to talk about that. And then afterwards, I'm going to be looking for those brave hands that are willing to shoot up in a room of 100 people. I know you can do it because I'm right here doing it with you, right? And are willing to tell us a little bit about what answers you found to these questions. Any questions about what we're going to do? 10 minutes? Those questions, these examples. All right, go. Okay, we have arrived at the 10-minute mark. So this is the time where I'm hoping I can hear from some of you, some of your thoughts, some of your ideas, some of the things you're thinking about when, how you would tell one of these stories, one or more of these stories it could be. I don't need a full report back, and we're not going to do every single group. We're just kind of, but I'd love to know what was interesting to you about this? What was surprising to you about this? Did people say things, did you agree? Did you disagree at any point? All of those would be, any of that would be interesting. What did you learn from trying this with these kinds of stories? Anybody? Okay. Awesome.
What's important to them. The Academy of Arts might not mean anything to them until you start talking about the other individuals that they've heard of,
right.
Big names that are in that, to realize, wow, she really was spectacular. She was, in times, influential people. She's got those building blocks here in Illinois. You can help support these causes to build the next person to get to the Academy.
Yeah. Absolutely. So that illustrates how you kind of need to know not just the story, but also the context of the story, right? So I mentioned the context of the conversation with you guys. There's also the context of what else is out there about this story? What else does the audience need to know in order to understand the meaning, the import, in a sense, of what that is? What other things? Yeah.
Kind of along the lines of context, in each of the stories we read, when and how was kind of dependent on who we were telling the story to, because each of these could have multiple audiences, and so when we're speaking with a donor versus speaking with a colleague or a student trying to get them excited, that message changes a little bit.
Absolutely, yeah. The audience is part of the process. They're not separate from it. They're actually, how you tell something varies depending on your audience. And the thing that storytelling gives you that most other places don't is that that's a good thing. That's actually appropriate. That's a core way of communicating, is to make sure that you're tuned in enough to the people you're talking to that you do make variation. Did you guys have any particular example that stands out for one of the stories that maybe would illustrate that?
One of them was about the Japanese alum winning the first International Achievement Award, and there's kind of the award component, which is really great, but there's also the alum herself, and the story talks a lot about the alum, but with the donor, we might talk a little bit more about the program.
Sure.
Or if it's an international audience, kind of speaking
Absolutely, yeah. A student might be looking for mentors or role models or even just, heroes, right? I mean, that's an important part of storytelling too, yeah. Any other thoughts before yeah, please.
Just that a lot of the major gift officers serve as ambassadors for the entire university.
Yes.
Particular unit, so
Yes.
understanding what's going on across campus, even if it's not directly related to our expertise.
I think so too. I think it's a vital thing. It does a couple of things. One thing is it shows that you're connected, and that alone is is that a message you guys were talking about? What were you going to say? No, it shows you're connected, right? I mean, that's part of what, if I'm a donor and I have some serious time or money to give, right, and I want to make a big impact, I need to know the person that's facilitating that relationship has lots of options, right? Has lots of ways of thinking about this, has that breadth. I think that's important. So yeah, part of what an implicit thing here is that I think our stories are important. Yeah.
In the spirit of citing my source.
Yeah. I saw. It's a great thing about live storytelling. Sometimes you can see. I saw that. I saw that citation happening, and that's great in live time. It's awesome. Any other thoughts on this one before we? Those are all excellent points. They're really excellent points about thinking through how we mobilize this. Okay, so I told you that I believe it's really important to learn a story well enough that you can tell it by heart. By heart is kind of an old-fashioned way of saying things, and I liked this. I actually flipped the image upside down. It's this book from this art display where the book was sort of hanging, and I thought, no, let's turn it up. And then only this morning did I realize it actually kind of looks like a heart, so that was funny. But I want to reiterate this because telling it by heart and really knowing what you're doing and being a seriously prepared person who knows a lot of different stories about the institution go hand in hand. These two things go together. It is vital that you have the information that you need about the institution and you can move that quickly into conversation in order to make the most natural, seamless, heartfelt kinds of connections. And when we're talking about telling it by heart, we're talking about you and your knowledge of the story and your knowing it so well that you can tell it 6 different ways, right? I mean, just all upside down and backwards if you need to. We're also talking about the connection between us and the donor. We're talking about the ways that stories move us. And stories tend to move us when it helps, when the person telling it finds the story meaningful to them. So this is another thing that I found in decade plus of teaching storytelling is that it's not that every story I've given you, I'm asking you to work with examples, and I know that that's limited to a certain number of examples, although I was very careful, as you noted, to pull from across the university in the examples and gave you 2 different sets partly for that reason. But that's, the examples have their limits, but the things that are meaningful to you also matter. So finding ways to do both, to have your heart and your brain connected, are really the kinds of things we'll talk about next. I'm going to trust you guys because I know the kind of work you're doing, that you've got that you know how to get your hearts connected, right? In a way, that's your work, that's internal. That's not necessarily something that in a 90-minute workshop we could even delve deeply enough into to really get to. So I'm going to trust you that you know your hearts and you know kind of how to mobilize that part of telling it by heart. And what I'm going to give you is the brains, because that I can offer, right? That I can do something about with our 30 minutes or so we have, or about 40 minutes we have left. I can do some serious traction on the brains part of this because I've done this a lot. So what I'm going to do next is going to seem a little counterintuitive. So this you've seen before. This is what I like to call the chronological structure of stories. Chronological structure is great. I want you to actually ignore this. This is fantastic. This is what you learned in 3rd or 4th grade when you were looking at stories and saying, okay, this is how they work, and there's this rising action and falling action. What I'm going to tell you right now is that this structure doesn't help us learn stories very well. I have played with this a lot. And the thing about beginning, middle, and end as a concept and as your only concept in the whole rising action and falling action is it doesn't give you enough to grab onto, right? It's the whole story. It's just a picture of the whole story. That doesn't really help you. That's sort of like saying memorize it. And when I'm saying tell it by heart, part of what I'm saying is don't memorize it. It's not going to do you any good. It's not going to be flexible enough. You're not going to know it in a flexible enough way to mobilize it. So while this is great stuff, and thank you Aristotle's Poetics for pointing some of this out in the early days, right? Like, all that's great. While this is great stuff, I actually want you to put it completely aside. I want us to do something else. So I'm going to give you 2 structures to play with. And those are what I like to call, and this is the research I've been working on lately and kind of developing, the logical structures of storytelling. There are 2 categories. We're going to do something a little bit artificial today, which is that I'm going to assign your group to one of the categories. I know that it may not perfectly fit with the examples, but I'm hopeful that it'll give you something to get some traction on. These are much better categories, in my experience, for learning how to tell stories, for understanding what's going on in a story. So character, plot, and setting, right? Let's start there because that's most like, I mean, plot especially too has this list kind of quality that's most like the chart I asked you to throw out. So when you're telling a story, I'm going to suggest to you that you look at character as the thing, usually a person, but not always, that goes through a transformation over the course of a story. A transformation, a typical transformation is learning something. So in Little Red Riding Hood, is there anybody here who does not know Little Red Riding Hood? It's okay if you don't. Just raise your hand. I just need to know real quick, because otherwise I'm going to recap that story for you in brief. Everybody knows you promise me you know Little Red Riding Hood. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go on. So what transforms is Little Red Riding Hood's understanding of don't go out in the woods and just talk to wolves. Like, don't do that. It's a bad idea, right? Terrible idea. The plot in that case, you know, we've got her going out in the woods, talking to the wolf, which she's not supposed to do, going to Grandma's house. Oh no, it's not Grandma, it's a wolf. Running around, huntsman comes, saves the day, and that's all good. I actually have a story song version of that where I have the grandmother save the day just because, you know, go Grandma. But anyhow, in the traditional versions, typically that's the way it goes. Plot is some kind of plausible causality. Now, I recognize I'm talking about Little Red Riding Hood and it's a wolf and it's not plausible at all, except that our ancestors would have said that wolves were very plausibly dangerous. So that one thing does actually matter, right? But for the purposes of story, what we mean is whether it's investing full belief in the accuracy of a database story, an evidence-driven storytelling, or whether it's suspending disbelief for a more fanciful kind of fantasy story, some kind of connection between the events that makes enough sense that we're like, yeah, that probably could have happened in some imaginable world, whether it's this one or a different one. And then the setting is the facts and the context. So you need some things like the woods. There are things we know about the woods. The woods is not a safe place. The forest is not, you know, is not a place you want to be lost in. There's a basket full of goodies. And there's what happened, kind of the context of what she's supposed to be doing. So she's supposed to be delivering goodies to Grandma, right? That's it. There's a whole other way of looking at stories that I've been developing mostly in relation to data storytelling, and I've got a couple of colleagues I'm working on this with, one actually from University of Illinois Chicago in the business school, one who's a recent grad who works doing data visualization for one of the major power companies in Arizona, and a third one who's actually on campus working on how to teach people coding. So I've got a couple of colleagues in different areas of data that I'm working with, thinking about what does data storytelling look like. And so one thing I didn't do for you was categorize the stories you have as either more character setting plot stories or more enigmas and information stories. But I want to argue that, based on what I'm finding so far with these colleagues and the work we're doing, that this idea of enigmas and information, or really simply put, questions and answers, is also important. So I should have shown this earlier, but anyhow, Little Red Riding Hood. It's actually a really scary story, right? It's part of one of my storytelling teachers, Dr. Betsy Hearn, likes to say that all stories are about survival, and this one certainly is. But at any rate, logical structure. Let me break it down for you in the 2 ways. So number 1 is character setting plot, right, or character plot setting. Number 2 is an example of how you might think about a question and answer version of storytelling, and I'm showing you this in some detail, and I've actually got one of these for each table to hold on to while we play with these ideas, because I'm going to make you do this next. Of course, you knew that. So this is one way of going through Little Red Riding Hood and charting it out as a series of questions and answers. A lot of times in data storytelling, you will see this functioning. So if you look at New York Times and kind of video-based stories, if you look at the ways that you set up a question, you try to get your audience curious about what is the case, and then you show them pieces of evidence that help to illuminate the answer to that question, and then follow-up questions, and that's how data stories are built. So if we treated Little Red Riding Hood like a data story, then a potential question would be, what's in the basket? This gets kind of away from the emotional qualities of the learning of Little Red Riding Hood. It gets into the learning qualities of the audience. What is the audience taking away? One book that I read, storytelling with data, actually argued that the audience becomes the hero in data stories because they are the people who are learning something, right? They are the characters that are transforming. So I found this really interesting. So what's in the basket? There's treats for grandma. That's the first question that literally gets asked in the story by the wolf. Where are you going and what's in the basket? What's wrong with grandma is the question Little Red Riding Hood asks, and then you go through this litany of eyes, nose, what big teeth you have, all the better to eat you with. And then what's wrong with grandma is that it's a wolf, it's not grandma. So Little Red Riding Hood has a big moment of learning in this. It's an important moment of learning, right? And then, will she be eaten? This is the question we're all asking by the end of this story. No, the huntsman rescues her, and that's how this happens. So, what I'm playing with here is the idea that the logical structures of storytelling can help you learn it faster. And the reason that I know that this works is that I've watched my students for about a decade trying to learn stories. I make my graduate students tell 3 stories in each class, and then they do a 4th digital storytelling final project. So I've watched a lot of people in a supportive environment. We have certain kinds of rules. I always say to the audience, for the tellers, if you think you have a criticism, ask a question. I actually think that's a pretty good rule for life. But if you think you have a criticism, ask a question, kind of saves the teller, keeps the teller in power in those ways. The teller has been working hard to learn this story. There are many right ways to learn stories. There are storyboarding. Some of you have probably seen that. You can make a list. Being a kind of logically oriented person, that's actually my favorite, is just making a list of the plot elements, so that can be helpful. There are ways that involve hearing yourself tell it, so actually acoustic, learning it. Some people learn stories not by memorization, but almost like they learn music. They've told me. They learn it like music because they'll remember the chorus or kind of the, oh, grandma, what big eyes you have. I mean, that becomes a sort of a chorus that's repeated in certain kinds of folklore. In data stories, we have less choruses, but we might have repeated questions. The question can become kind of a chorus. So I want you to try this and see if, now that you've looked at these stories, you've got 3 examples. We'll use the same 3 examples. We're going to have groups 1 and groups 2. I'm going to have you count off. Why don't we start with you guys as a 1? Back there, you're a 2. You guys, 1. Here, 2. 1. 2. You're already 1. 1. 2. 1 back there. All right. 2 back there in the middle. Yeah, middle. Actually, 2. You guys are 1 in the very back. Sorry, that was my mouth-brain connection. 2 up front. 1 right up here. 2 over there. And 1 right here. And that's everybody. I'm going to do the same-ish thing again. I'm going to give you a little bit longer because I actually can tell you also want a little coffee. I can just feel that in the room. So I'm going to give you 15 minutes on this one because it's a harder puzzle. And I also always like to say, too, when I am doing any kind of workshop, when I give you a hard problem, I give you each other. So be kind to each other. And if you think you have a criticism, ask a question, right? That's really it. Okay, so I'm going to set the timer for about 15 minutes. I'm going to come around and give a handout of the logical structure the example that I gave you, so you can look at that. And now you can go. Okay. I just got a very important question. I'm so sorry, I hate to do this, but I'm actually going to interrupt and draw you back just for a second. I'm going to get you back. I know I'm going to get you back in just a half a second. I'm sure I can do it. And it's happening, and you're almost back with me. I just had a question that was very important, and it was, what are we supposed to do for 15 minutes? It's a really good question. I want you to take 1 or more of the example stories that I've given you and break it down just like I've broken things down here into these elements. If you're a 1, you're breaking it down into character, plot, and setting. If you're a 2, you're breaking it down into, we'll just call it questions and answers. And I'm going to bring around the example that I showed you earlier. Anybody confused? Don't be shy. Okay, go. All right. Okay. And we're back. Let's see if I can bring you back. I have my same confidence that I did previously that I can. This is lively. This is good. This is not a sedate kind of room right now. You guys are pretty chill. But not sedate, I would say. Uh-oh. Is that what's up? How about that one? This one? This one, this one? This one trying? You know what? It's because it fell off and it pulled it down. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, so let's come back together here in the large group. It's pretty clear to me that this did something in the room, something more than... I wonder if the mic got turned down while I was at the... You want to check that real quick? See if that's better now. Okay, yeah, I can hear that that's a little bit better. Okay, so I want to talk about this one too. And we're going to, this time, because I did ask you to be groups 1 and group 2, and the reason I counted you off is because you have the same stories on the same side of the room. I wanted to try it with the different stories and see what works. I want to hear about this. I want to know what you found. I can tell that it created a lively conversation. So far, I've got that. I want to know what else there is to know about that lively conversation and what happened. So let's first start with the people who, anybody in a 1 designated group who focused on character, plot, and setting. What did you find as you did this? Could you find characters, plots, and settings for all of these stories? Was it easy? Was it hard? Are there questions you have after trying this? Can you see how it would help you learn stories? Are you still wondering if it would help? If you might need other techniques that would work better for you? Anybody in group 1? Character, plot, setting. I'll ask group 1s this question. Is it easy to find the plot in these stories? Yes to some. Are there any no's to that?
Some are lengthy. You know, there's kind of lengthy chain of events. So doing that and trying to distill down to the essence of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it takes a little thinking. You just have to think about, okay, what are the aspects of this story structurally that are the plot, right? I'm going to assume character is pretty easy to find, right? How about setting of the story? We talked about setting of the telling before. Now it's setting of the story. Is it pretty clear what the setting is in most of these? Were there any moments where it wasn't clear?
We just had a question whether
Sure.
it mattered your order, like we found ourselves automatically going from character to setting.
I think that's a good order too. Honestly, I've actually been playing with this, and this was part of the data storytelling thinking, is that I think it's hard to think about data stories without going to plot pretty early on. But yeah, I think you're right. The order doesn't matter deeply to me. It was really more about all 3 elements. Do you know the stories differently now than when you started? Yes. What do you know now? What helps you about doing this to mobilize this? You've got a different handle on it. Yeah, that's what I was expecting. It's what I've seen before.
It makes you focus on details.
Yeah, that's right. That's a big part of storytelling right there. You think that it's the arc and the gesture, and I think we attribute a lot to personalities of tellers that it's really, really kind of overblown. It's a lot about the details. It's a lot about what gets left in and what gets cut out. The reason I always go back to folklore is that details, when you've got generations of people telling a story over hundreds of years, get refined. They just get refined. Some things stay, some things go. That not everything stays in the story over time. So a lot of your job is to figure out which details are important, which things do I need to say to make this make sense. Anything else from anybody in the group 1s? Were there parts of this that were a struggle or not helpful? Did it change anything about how you use the story in a way that you wish it hadn't? I mean, the way that you think about the story in a way that you wish it hadn't. I think it's easier with stories that you were handed today and not stories that you love. So I will say, a thing that happens sometimes, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was just thinking though, I don't know that I agree completely that the details are the critical piece, because what does sustain the story is the ultimate essence of it.
Yeah.
And it's not, so with the stories we were looking at,
Yeah.
it's not necessarily when it happened or where it happened or
Yeah.
specifics, it's the transformation that took place, it's the
Yeah.
learning that took place. And if you're true to that, and where I think they resonate the most is, in our cases, it's reflecting and revealing the core values of the institution.
Yes.
So, to me, if you miss
I actually think that's right too. I think it's trying to figure out which details you're going to pick and what are you going to say. Before I let you go, I'm going to have you do one quick exercise with what are you going to say, so that you know how to launch or close the story, right? Because that's a big part of figuring this out, is how do you what's the first sentence or what's the last sentence, right? That's what would you say to start or finish a story. Yeah, I think those can actually both be true. You know, I do think in folklore a lot, in which case over time a lot of details get knocked out. And that, to me, that transformation is important. But the meaning, conveying the meaning is what we know, that's what works. You actually can convey the meaning a lot of different ways. Storytelling is really just one way. But it's one that works pretty well for face-to-face interactions, for sure. Group 2, folks who I asked to do this completely, very different kind of way of thinking, questions and answers throughout. Did this work with the stories that you had? Were there places where you struggled? Did it help you to know the story better? What are you thinking about with that approach? Anybody in the group 2s? Yeah.
Yeah, I personalized the stories a lot because the questions were very sort of paradigmatic. Like they all existed in the same framework. Who are these people?
Mm-hmm.
What are they accomplishing?
Mm-hmm.
What is their goal? How are they accomplishing this goal?
Yeah. That's interesting too, and it makes me think about the things that advancement stories have in common. That there's some commonalities that really lend themselves to those, exactly the things you just named. Impact is what I always go to, right? The word impact. What's the impact going to be? Other things from group 2. Folks, I feel that afternoon low. I know it too. It happens to me too. Is there anything not helpful about approaching it as questions and answers? Yeah.
Not answering that question.
That's all right.
It was interesting what questions people asked, because it showed, even in this small focus group, like people connected to different parts of the story.
Yes. Yeah. One of the most important things about storytelling being a dynamic relationship in a triangle shape is that we do our level best to make great stories available to people, and they just interpret them however they're going to interpret them their own whole ways. So our control is meaningful in that we can tell important stories, and there's some evidence even that parts of our brainwaves sync up when we're hearing stories, but brainwaves syncing and taking the same meaning away are not the same things, right? The audience is still very much in control of what they learn. But I think you can do a lot to influence your audience by making sure you understand, just like your group talked about earlier on, what's the context? Who are you talking to? What do those people care about? Is it in the context of an established relationship or a new relationship? Those are the kinds of things you might take into account. What do you already know about that conversation? Those sorts of things.
I think in each one of the stories that we looked at here, we always had the question, we had one question further than what we had the answer to.
That's interesting.
What is just the next step beyond that? Or what is this
Yeah.
person doing now? Or was she able to find this job? Or
Yeah.
it was also always, we just had a little bit more that we wanted to know.
Yeah, that's interesting too. I haven't thought about that before. That's interesting to think about. That might have to do with journalism and questions and answers. I'm looking at my favorite journalist anyhow. Journalism and questions and answers, and kind of how that you have a limited space. You can't answer all the questions, but you have to answer enough questions that people are going to be intrigued to keep reading. There's a theory that there are lots of theories about stories, right? I didn't burden you with very many of them, but there's this guy, Tsvetan Todorov, who's a Russian guy who talks about equilibrium and disequilibrium and re-equilibrium as being a concept, and it's based on that, plus Roland Barthes' enigma theory from SZ and the 5 codes. I could geek out real hard, you guys, that I try to bring things that I think are going to be sort of relevant and workable. So, yeah. All right, well, let's, that was what you find. I think we are down to super short time. If we had longer time, I'll give you 2 things that I would suggest we do together if we had longer time. And so one is this exercise of the first sentence or the last sentence. I find in my life, especially knowing the first sentence of a story, and I mean this both in my professional life as an administrator, as a faculty member who's trying to contribute to things like advancement, and as a person who's done storytelling performances, as a performer. I've actually got Oakwood Public Library on the calendar for August 13th, so that'll be fun if anybody's out in Oakwood. Let me know. So in all those contexts, it is very helpful for me to know the first sentence and know that one really well. And sometimes I do memorize the first sentence. So there's always an exception to these rules, and I would say that's a potential one for you to think about. I know a great guy who, there was this amazing alum who, these are the ways that these things often start. So we won't do that for the moment. I do want to do one other exercise, and if we had a lot of time, we would talk about some of your best moments in connecting. This really is your homework. I set this up because I'd like you to go think about this. What are the best moments you've had in connecting with people, either as coworkers or as in a donor relationship? What are those best moments, and how have stories factored in? Or what stories do you have of those great moments? Because that's something I've done with folks before in advancement, is actually mobilize those stories so that we can inspire each other. I recommend that. I think it's a good practice. But for right now, I just want to do a show of hands thing. This show of hands thing is about 6 categories. This is not my theory. This is actually Annette Simmons' theory. She says that there are 6 categories of stories that really help people to make an impact. And I guess what I'm doing right now with you is we're just going to test this out. So you can raise your hand multiple times. You can raise your hand to indicate multiple stories. We're still working with the examples that I gave you today. But these 6 things, she's got a great book called The Story Factor, and I would highly recommend it. So who am I? Why am I here? The vision story, teaching stories, values and action stories, and I know what you're thinking stories. I don't want to elaborate too much on this because we don't have enough time, but I would love to see a show of hands if you feel like one of the stories that you worked with today fit into who am I stories. I didn't expect there'd be a lot, but there's a couple. Okay, you guys, a couple, yeah. How about why am I here stories? Any of those? Okay, a few people, yeah. How about the vision story? More of those. I think a lot more advancement stories are about vision and kind of big picture and where we're going, and about the future. And that's what really characterizes a vision story. How about teaching stories? A few? Yeah. Things that were learned. I think that's partly implicit to an educational context, but I also think it's about the transformation we see in a character, so to speak. Values and action stories. Yeah. Everybody had something like this. This is another thing that I think is key to advancement storytelling, values and action. It's partly about the future, but in this case, it's kind of about looking back. How have our values been in action over time? What impacts have we made already? And how do we expect those to be sustained or to grow or to transform over time? That's a big question. I know what you're thinking stories. Any of those? Not so much. I think that's more of an oral thing. I think that happens mostly in oral and maybe in social media sometimes where you have a live interaction. So I wanted to leave you with that. And then also, it says space for questions. Really, we have 2 minutes. If you have any, I'd be glad to answer them. I do want to thank you guys. It's really a pleasure to get to be here. I work on this stuff all the time. And I am going to ask Elizabeth to share with you an evaluation of the work that I've done, partly because I would like to know what you're thinking and how this works for you, and partly because after that evaluation, which is just a 4-question, it's super simple, I have an opportunity for people to be part of my research. I'm launching a new project called Storytelling at Work. So I'm interested in advancement, but I'm also interested in lots of professional contexts where stories matter, where stories connect people. And I'm launching a project where I'll be interviewing people about how storytelling has functioned in your work. So I would love your evaluation of the session. And if you are interested, no pressure. I have IRB for all of this, so I would be telling you that you could go away at any time and not participate. If you're familiar with IRB, you know this language. But if you're interested in this, I would also love to interview some of you who might be willing about your experience with storytelling and advancement. So thank you so much for having me today. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you.